before we turn to the immediate present, Sunil, we're sort of trying to bifurcate this division, Western and post-colonial. You have of course worked on the question of modernist nationalism, certainly in India, extensively. I mean, how do you see, from your perspective, from as a historian, the issue of mid-century nationalism and the post-colonial question? And if you can, how does it connect to art and architecture?
Sure. No, thank you. So I mean, perhaps rather than thinking about the moments of critique, one might just think about the different valuations of forms of modernism in India and how that's changed at different moments. And I mean, I guess what I would say and see is that, the way modernism comes to India is very much as through a cultural and political impulse. It's not driven by, for instance, changes in the industrial forms and structures of production, which are very important to the way modernism develops in the West. I mean, it's really in relation to industrial design and those sorts of imperatives that modernism starts to emerge. That's not the case in India. It's very much driven, and in that sense, it's an elite and very largely a state initiative that brings modernism to India. So it's the aesthetics and the politics which bring it, I think, to India. And that means that the kind of modernism that crystallizes in India is very different. And so if you take Chandigarh, I would say it's a kind of bureaucratic modernism that Chandigarh comes to represent. It's a form of modernism where the rest of society is actively insulated. As you know, Corbusier himself stipulated, this was a seat of government and administration, no industry, no manufacture, no real life of India should kind of contaminate the monumental structures of modernism. And then, in the introduction, in the sort of audiovisual, you had something about how, the furniture, the movable objects of modernism, the furniture, etc., suddenly took on this valuation through the market.
Recently,
yeah, and that's a moment I know well, because I was actually in Chandigarh in the 90s with some French dealers at the time. I happen who, and the point there is that, you saw this furniture, and it was essentially, it was government, it was all marked in white paint with government inventory numbers. It had this kind of, there was no aesthetic valuation given to it. It was a bureaucratic piece of, instrumental use. And of course, the 90s was also a moment when India was opening to the market. And suddenly new kinds of furniture were available, new kinds of modern furniture. So there was this sense of, out with the old. Who wants this old wooden furniture? Let's get the new stuff that the market is bringing. So there was a kind of, shift in that valuation. So I think that's a kind of more specific aspect to the question. There is a more general issue, which is really about India as a post-colonial new nation, what its valuation of and its relationship to its past is, both its intermediate past and also, above all, its recent past. That's to say, a past which has been dominated by colonialism, by the West, and beyond that, intermediately, the past in which the Mughals ruled. And what you see playing out today in India is a kind of anxiety, not just of influence, but an anxiety of what's seen as Western influence, and perhaps even influence that has come from the West. And so there's this kind of urge to erase that past, but it's an unease, because at the same time there's a sense that that past is valuable, not least economically, for tourism, for other kinds of purposes. So there's a kind of sort of almost a schizophrenic relationship. So you can destroy mosques because they are a kind of reminder, as you see it, to a kind of moment of your of injury and conquest. You can, but at the same time, you know, the Taj Mahal is like you don't want. I mean, that's that's the kind of source of your economic, you know, tourism revenue. So I think there's two aspects to these changing valuations of the past, that the objects that were created by the recent past.
It becomes a question of, I mean, what is trash and what is treasure, right? I mean, that becomes, in a sense, the preservation question as indexed to ideological and political questions, right? I mean, we are now, the anxiety of influence is politicized in many different ways. And is it not? So how do you describe, you know, the modernist, the Nehruvian moment's adoption of Western modernism? Is it as a political thing? Is this simply a matter of the cultural rooting of the Indian nationalist elites? Or is it also an iteration of this question of influence and the anxiety of influence in different ways? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Could I just, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to see that the kind of what we call Nehruvian modernism. I mean, the Nehruvian project was not simply a modernist one. It was a vastly plural one. And I think the important thing to remember is that, you know, you mentioned Islamabad, Dhaka, Brasilia. These were capital cities that really were statements of the nation. Chandigarh was not a capital. Chandigarh was a state capital. And that was that in a sense, Nehru embraced the kind of past that existed within a city like Delhi and said it could be made Indian. But at the same time, he wanted the shock of a kind of modernism as well. But you know, not to erase what was already there, or not to kind of, he wanted it as part of a kind of multi-stranded you know, reinvention of India, I think. So it wasn't a full commitment in that way. And I think it's important to see that, to nuance that, because he was also very sensitive to the past, to the heritage of the past, to the folkloric traditions, to the more popular traditions as well. I think this what he was trying to do, perhaps unsuccessfully, was to try and blend them into a more distinctive Indian approach, rather than to go all out for one. So, you know, Chandigarh, as he said in one of his speeches, it's like a hammer blow for India. It was a sort of necessary shock that India needed in order to kind of
make you think.
Yes, and to activate this kind of dormant intellectual and aesthetic, or suppressed intellectual and aesthetic capacities that had sort of been, you know, pushed down by colonialism. So I think it was part of a broader strategy, of a plural project, both aesthetically and politically. And I think that's important.
Mark, what do you think, as an advocate of the global history in the field of, you know, colonialism, post-colonial anxieties of influence on other sides, Indian nationalism, in this field, does this all in general as an overall field describe the mechanics of what you would call global modernism at work, or how would you describe this?
Well, Vikram, that's a great question, and I want to get my hands in that. But I'd like to go back. Can I
Please.
Before we turn page to the conversation preceding us about critique of modernism, which I find extremely fascinating. Can I do that?
Please, go ahead.
Build a little bit on previous comments. And to start off with, I would just like to, what comes to mind is a reference in your book on page 97, where you talk about Aditya Prakash's work as negotiating the difference between things that look modern and them be modern, and look at, or in quotations. And, you know, I read that and I had to put the book down because my head just went like that, you know, and really had to sort of try to understand how, what that means. It's an extremely simple sentence, but it's a very provocative one. And I tried to just sort of unpack it in the context of what you were writing and saying, and about now what I'm hearing, you know, in this conversation, very wonderful conversation about critique. Because of course, to look modern privileges a sense of aestheticality, the opticality, the immediacy of something, even though it requires a certain type of learning of how to look, I understand that. But to be modern, actually also privilege something very different, which is has to do a lot with textuality, with writing, with reading and understanding and positioning yourself within the textual culture of modern, on the one hand, but also positioning yourself within the ontological culture of the modern, which is what you try to outline in the continuous line, right? That, you know, that your father was modern, right? Whether, no matter what he did, you know, it was modern because of his ontological position in the framework, including whatever critiques and experimentalities that might embrace, right? So a very broad range of realities that are much broader than just sort of the look. And you try to both honor his attempt to put these together, but you, every, you know, 5 or 6 pages sort of throw in the idea that there's this line, but also there's this weird shadow, where the line actually is a bit more troubling than one thinks. And this particular moment is where you sort of, you know, talk about the theater, and there's a truss in the theater. And Prakash wanted the truss to be visible and seen because he's modern, and that's the way it was. And Corbusier comes and said, yes, that's great. But then the local guys wanted the hung ceiling, and then come the restorers recently, and they put in the hung ceiling. So the question is, which is more modern, right? Is the hung ceiling really not just as modern as the truss? You know, after all, you know, I mean, yes, we can be seduced by the fact that the modern moderns, the real moderns, wanted it to be seen and visible. But there's this other modern, which is a modern of, you know, it just has to look modern, and that's good enough. And so the hung ceiling might be absolutely something one wants to embrace, because it's just another way of doing modern in a different syntax, in a different culture. And so that's where, and you sort of are a little bit negative about the hung ceiling, understandably, but you don't actually necessarily come out and critique it as necessarily an evil either. So, you know, you leave it, so preservationists have to sort of puzzle this thing out as they necessarily should, you know. And maybe they could put windows in the hung ceiling so you can have the ceiling, but also have these plexiglass.
But see it also. Yeah, that's kind of like a postmodern. Yeah, I mean, this is I mean, for the audience also, there's a discussion in the book, and which was an important thing in Chandigarh. You know, should things look a certain way, or they have to be properly made in a certain way? Famously, for instance, in Corbusier's High Court, the arches of the High Court are actually hung, believe it or not, although you would think they hold up the roof. I know this is getting, you know, very specifically technical. And in Aditya Prakash's buildings, again, there was a constant battle between the economics of the engineers who said, well, we can just build this roof much cheaper if we throw a few trusses rather than actually follow the curve. So there's a schism between this appearance of modernism and being modernism. And can I go back to the question of those chairs, Sunil, that you brought up in this context? You know, those chairs, which were made in the 1950s as part of the Chandigarh project, and they were made by the thousands and put into all, not just the chair, the furniture, let's just say, of Jamiga Furniture of the 50s and 60s, made by the thousands. And it was made in those huge numbers, basically because that was the cheap way to build the furniture, right? Off the shelf from a catalog furniture was much more expensive. The cheapest way was to design the furniture in the evening after you had done master planning and building design in the morning, and after in the evening after drinks you design furniture, and then that was made cheaply and locally and by the thousands. And it was frankly not designed to be last forever because it was quickly made. So 40, 50 years later, so again, how things are made and how they appear. 40, 50 years later, it's breaking down and it's being auctioned and being sold mostly to recyclers from the Chandigarh region who sell it off to the informal settlements or use it for firewood. But then it is taken to France and New York and Chicago and sold, restored, fixed. But those numbers that you're talking about, Sunil, which authenticate these as being appear visibly from that Indian moment, critically put those into evaluations of, I don't know, what is it, $30,000 a chair, or what is it? So is that, what is that? Is that preservation? What is it?
Well, I think that's exactly right what you just said. These were made because it was the cheapest way to furnish these new offices. What makes them valuable today to sort of connoisseurs of modernism is precisely that handmade element of them. That they're both modern in design, but they have this craft hand element of them, which of course someone, one forgets. I mean, Corbusier, at the same time that he was building Chandigarh and the Unité d'Habitation, he was living in his 12 by 12 cabin, plywood and log cabin in Roquebrune. So he also, he was split in his own mind between this valuation of the monumental and the sort of extra human, and then the very intimate and the sort of handmade, handcrafted. And I think, what this furniture brings is that kind of the immediacy of that early moment of modernism, when you thought in terms of these, rational, geometric forms, but you built them with all the mistakes and quirks of handcrafting and the marks of handcrafting. And I think that's precisely what in the 1990s, when you had a new kind of modernism, to use Marx' formulation, the new kinds of furniture available through the world, the India opening up to the world market and liberalization and so on, that became valuable to Indians in these offices who wanted to be, out with this crafty type of stuff and get the kind of sleek aluminum, metal, laminate, the modern stuff. And I think that's part of what was going on there.
And I think there was a big shift even in modernism. If you look at the work of Charlotte Perriand, who was the first designer for Corbusier's chrome and leather furniture, by the time she came back from Japan after the war, was entirely involved in building and craft wood, and very beautiful wood. And we find that in America too, with Noguchi and others.
But
Mark, you were trying to jump in? Yeah.
There's also a factor which is the cult of the chair itself in modernism. Already Barnes and me, there was not a modern architect who didn't, want to do a chair. And it becomes, if you will, a type of token of a certain type of theoretical performativity, that sort of tried to overcome the alienation of modernism by saying, listen, I can make you quote unquote comfortable or pretend comfortable or not. That was sort of its outreach, to its sort of the human that had been put under stress through the modernism themselves, right? So furniture had a powerful in the narrative of modern architecture, and this sort of plays into that. I mean, then it becomes capitalized and commercialized and circulated once again through the narratives, of neo-global, neo-modernist performativities.
Okay, so let's ask. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think this goes also back to the way in which the modernist making in India was not an industrial process. So it was this handmade. Whereas the Eameses in America were using industrial processes and trying to make it large, mass scale and cheap, in India you had to actually artisanally make your kind of modern world, which then to Indians in later decades looked homey, sort of crafty. It was not. Whereas to a Western connoisseur, this was kind of the authentic modern. This was the handmade, but with this kind of design element. And I think that transvaluation of values, in a sense, is something that lies behind some of this shift.